Thank you very much, and good evening and welcome to this National Security Discussion Forum. Welcome to the panelists, the distinguished panelists, and welcome to other participants who are following the live on Facebook. Crime is a very topical subject in Jamaica today. What with the recently declared states of emergency and the debates within and outside Parliament around that issue. Very often, debate is dominated by crime control measures. That is what the police and the military do, which also tend to dominate the allocation of budgets. There is a global trend towards the militarization of policing, and we see that in Jamaica as well, as an increasing proportion of the budget of the Ministry of National Security is going to the military as opposed to the police and the correctional services and the other agencies of the ministry. So the topic this evening looks at the crime prevention side of this equation. And I'm going to introduce our panelists. I'm going to start with the person who is the chairman of the National Security Task Force Commission, or Task Force rather, Dr. Shane Alexis. He is better known in the health field, but as violence is often referred to as an epidemic, and in many ways behaves and responds similar to an epidemic. For example, the best predictor of a case of violence is a previous case of violence, just as I imagine the best predictor of a case of COVID-19 is a previous case of COVID-19. So welcome, Shane. Shane is, and his task force are really the organizers for this evening. And then we have our distinguished panelists coming all the way from Nicaragua via California this evening. We have Valeria Gomez Palacios. She's a Nicaraguan public policy professional with demonstrated experience working with Latin American governments, research centers, the nonprofit sector, and multilateral organizations. Valeria is the network coordinator for the Peace in Our Cities network, which supports member cities and city-based organizations committed to implementing evidence-based and innovative solutions to urban violence. Then we have Joanna Callan. Joanna has been a researcher for the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, CAPRI, for over 3 years, during which she has helped produce 4 reports and has represented CAPRI at the National Consensus on Crime, as well as other local and international events. She has also produced reports for the US Department of State's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, the World Bank, and Insight Crime. And finally, we have Milton Tomlinson, who I have worked with extensively when I was the Minister of National Security in Jamaica. Milton is one of the best trained and most effective violence interrupters, working under the umbrella of the Peace Management Initiative, which in my time got considerable support from the government of Jamaica through our Citizen Security and Justice program. And we look forward to hearing of the real life successes that the Peace Management Initiative has had. So having given that introduction of our panelists, it is to turn over now, and I'm going to start, begin with the person who is coming from the furthest away, Valeria Gomez Palacios. Over to you, Valeria.
Thank you so much for this introduction, and it's an honor to be a part of this important panel and to be part of this conversation. As mentioned, I am the network coordinator for Peace in Our Cities, which is an urban network working to address the problem of urban violence. And my contribution to this panel today is to showcase the work of Peace in Our Cities, and in the process, also highlight what other cities have been doing to address urban violence, and also key lessons in violence preventions that we have learned as a network. So I will share my screen because I have a small presentation prepared. So I want to start by first giving you a small overview of what Peace in Our Cities is through a quick video.
Peace in Our Cities is a pioneering platform championing the bold goal of reducing urban violence by 50% in our communities. We believe that this is possible because we have tried and tested tools and evidence-based solutions that have drastically reduced violence in cities across the world. We are mayors, city leaders, civil society members, and representatives of international organizations and urban networks working to reduce urban violence and build peaceful, just, and inclusive communities. The increasingly urban nature of our interconnected world makes it critical for all of us to ensure that cities are safe for all. Although 9 of 10 people who are killed violently are outside of conflict zones, the resources invested in understanding how to protect people and reverse violence outside of conflict in our city streets and homes is woefully insufficient. Our aspirations are in line with the commitments made in the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and custom-tailored to our local contexts and the unique violence problems we face. Launched in 2019 as a campaign, Peace in Our Cities has since evolved into a platform that is working to amplify knowledge of the scale of urban violence problem and solutions that have proven to work. Advance evidence-based policy solutions and peacebuilding approaches to reduce violence in urban contexts. Accompany city leaders, community, and civil society partners through peer exchanges and information access to realize ambitious targets for violence reduction. Mayors and city leaders are eager partners, receptive to taking in and giving advice, support, and advocacy that is targeted to their needs in order to keep their communities safe. Join us as we work to catalyze actions to reduce violence and build peace.
So I want to talk to you about the problem of violence. As seen in the video, more people are dying in the streets of our cities than in conflict zones. When people think of violence, they tend to think of conflict zones, but the reality is that 9 out of 10 instances of lethal violence are occurring in our cities. Globally, violence containment is costing $14 trillion a year, and violence is projected to increase by 10% by 2030. And unfortunately, due to the pandemic, this number has only increased. In addition, the pandemic has also exacerbated different types of violence patterns in cities. We have seen an increase in violence against women, which the United Nations called an epidemic that is occurring. We have seen an increase in racism. We have seen an increase in xenophobia attacks. And we have also seen an increase in different types of online violence as a result of COVID-19. And while violence tends to differ in different cities, we have tested tools and evidence that have been proven to reduce violence. And it is exactly this type of evidence-based solutions that Peace in Our Cities seeks to promote and to advance in order to take meaningful progress to halve urban violence by 2030. So Peace in Our Cities is a growing network of 22 cities and 30 community-based international partners that are working together to halve urban violence by 2030. We do this by creating concrete and participatory and evidence-based platforms in order to prevent severe violence in member cities. And in order to make progress towards SDG 16, which seeks to promote peace, justice, and inclusive societies with a specific focus on SDG 16 to significantly reduce all forms of violence. The way we do this is by what we call the 3A method. We seek to amplify the knowledge of the scale of the urban violence problem, but also to amplify the solutions that exist to save lives. We seek to accompany our members, including city leaders and communities and civil society organizations and partners, in order to support the work that they're doing on the ground on violence prevention. And finally, we always seek to advance evidence-based informed solutions on peace-building initiatives to save lives and to build peaceful cities. So concrete examples of the way that we do this is to support city leaders. One of our member cities in Colombia, Palmira, during this past summer, there was an increase in levels of violence in Colombia, and Peace in Our Cities brought together experts and city leaders, as well as community organizations, in a thematic meeting. And this advisory meeting helped the city of Palmira incorporate some of the findings and recommendations into their national security strategy called PASOS. And as a result of this meeting, the city of Palmira was also able to work with the United Nations Institute of Disarmament Research to create a plan on ammunition resources for the city of Palmira. Other ways that we support city leaders include through our research. Through the research that was performed, we provide evidence-based solutions that then our city members are able to implement in their cities. As part of what we call the Peace Incentive Fund, which is a micro grant given to cities, we have been able to work with the city of Mechelen in Belgium for them to conduct research on the ways in which peer-to-peer approaches, as well as social media, can be used to curtail violent extremism and urban violence in the city of Mechelen in Belgium. And we also support city-based organizations. For example, financing from the Peace Incentive Fund has supported the Life and Peace Institute in Nairobi, who is working with security actors and community members in informal settlements in order to create better communications between security actors and the people living in these informal settlements, while also to create safe spaces for women and youth in these areas. Finally, why does all this matter? At Peace in Our Cities, we believe that mayors and local officials, as long as national security actors and community-based organizations, are able to lead the way in urban violence by focusing on localizing these initiatives that have proven to work and implementing them at the local city level. We believe that peaceful cities are enablers of development, and SDG 16 encompasses all other SDGs and all their achievements, because if we have peaceful cities that are working to reduce urban violence, then this can lead to development. And finally, I want to emphasize the importance of international actors and networks. Peace in Our Cities has existed for 2 years, and through our work, we have seen that working together with city leaders and working together with community-based organizations, we have been able to make progress towards our goal of reducing urban violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valeria. That's a good kickoff, very much in line with my own thinking. And when we come to the discussion segment, I definitely have a couple questions to drill down into. Now I'm going to invite Joanna. Milton, the ladies first, and then we'll come to you. So I'm inviting Joanna to make her presentations. And the presentation, folks, won't be more than 5 to 10 minutes each, because we want to ensure we leave half an hour to 45 minutes for discussion segments and to include our participants who are following on live stream, include your questions. Joanna?
Thank you, Senator Bunting, and good evening to all the viewers. And thank you for having me and for having Capri being represented at this panel. So I just want to make several points here, which is what we have in Jamaica now is something that has been 40 years, 40 years in the making, 4 decades of a culture of violence that has become very ingrained in our households from the micro level, the communities on the meso level and nationally on the macro level. And so that is what we are dealing with now. And one of the things that has been really highlighted recently is that we don't have a crime problem per se in Jamaica. What we have is a violence problem. And it's a violence problem that has really brought to the forefront or highlighted how badly Jamaica's situation is, whether it is violence against women being perpetrated by partners or being perpetrated by fellow family members, whether it's violence against youth. In the last 10 years, youth have accounted for 24% of the population that has been arrested and charged for various crimes. And so it comes from the systemic level where we really need to start addressing certain stuff, certain issues as it relates to parenting, as it relates to the community-based violence, which will then spread to the national perspective. And so crime prevention and crime control are very intimately intertwined in this. And we really had so many years of lack of investments in both the crime control and the crime prevention simultaneously. And we really need to step up those efforts in the crime prevention if it is that we're going to break that cycle of violence that is being perpetrated on our, by our citizens and taking the lives of our citizens at that. And one of the things recently that became very clear in the research that Capri has been doing is that while we have had so many social interventions over the last 4 decades, social programs, we have not consistently been monitoring and evaluating and taking on that evidence-based approach that Valeria has been talking about that her organization does. And so we really need to step up our game where monitoring and evaluation is concerned, making sure that monitoring and evaluation officers are included in the conceptualization process of the social interventions or social programs, that they're there during the implementation of these interventions, that the data is collected. The data is so important to produce that evidence-based approach that Valeria is talking about. And if we don't have that evidence where the data is collected, if the baseline measures are not established or a baseline study is not done in the community in which these interventions are taking place, we don't know whether or not these interventions have really achieved what it is that they set out to achieve. And so, whether or not those outcomes, that impact that we want to see. And there have been many social interventions that have really had impact on certain individuals in the communities that are recipients of these interventions, but we're not seeing where it's spreading out on the meso and the macro level, which is really what we want, right? Because at the end of the day, what is happening at that micro level is affecting us on the national level, right? And in moving forward, the collaboration and communication, and this was something else that we found, we have so many partners doing social interventions in communities, but there's no kind of collaboration or connection or communication between these actors. And it can be harmful to the very communities that you're trying to help, because if it is that each actor is doing its own form of a social intervention, then at the end of the day, you don't know whether or not whether it's being truly effective, and you can't really measure the way each social intervention impact, right? And it's very well, I've seen reports where a social intervention will say, we have been successful, but we didn't account for the other social interventions that were taking place in the community. That is not proof that this is working, because you don't know what impact the other interventions had. And moving forward, we really need to we really need to have a very evidence-based approach where the data is collected, the monitoring evaluation takes place, and there's much more collaboration between the NGOs, the government MDAs, the private sector, just to make sure that we're all on the same page to achieve what it is that we need to achieve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanna, and very concise, but high impact. Milton, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. The conversation is so interesting, I didn't even realize it was my time. So I just want to pick up of Joanna's because I want to agree with a number of points, a number of things that she had said. As it relates to monitoring and evaluation, we do very little of that over the past probably 20, 25 years. However, about 2 or 3 years ago, Dr. Herbert Gale and his team did some evaluation of the works of the peace management initiatives and released a report that report, brought about some new interest into the works of the PMI and social intervention itself. Yes, the intellectual approach as it relates to the data gathering and monitoring and evaluation, yes, we are weak in that area. And again, I must agree. However, we don't discount the actual community people and the actual happenings in the community, because when you hear a community over 3 years, having a certain level of violence, and it just keep repeating itself with a number of entities, different kind of interventions in that space with no result. From the peace management standpoint, we would sit back and we would walk the community. We would do what we call fact-finding as an organization. And during our fact-finding mission, that is when we start to plan the right intervention. We don't just run into a community as an organization and say peace. We do our work, we do our research, we do the background work, we do all of that before we even enter into the community. We actually know who we need to talk to in those communities before we enter. So there's some semblance of evaluation that is being done by the peace management initiatives. When you look and the type of results that we read in various communities across Jamaica, because we do work in Westmoreland, we do work in Hanover, Montego Bay, Clarendon. Clarendon was one of our worst, and I tell you, we go through hills and valleys, just to get to the people who we need to talk to. And I mean, there was some level of trending down in Clarendon. There's no one intervention that can take care of any community or any parish. It has to be a collaborative approach. And this is where I want to agree again that we were running in some trouble, because you have 3, 4, 5, 6 different agencies inside of a community working, trying to come up with to achieve the same goal, but yet still we're not working together. And that in itself, caused some tripping at times. I must agree with that. So communication and collaboration, monitoring and evaluation is some of our weaknesses as entities in the past. But moving full speed ahead, the various agencies, donor agencies, they are big, and that is a big part of the funding. And I mean, if there was some good work done, they would not have the confidence to kept on investing in the various programs. You can look for yourself. Since the Peace Management Initiative with the violence interruption program is not on the ground in these communities, you realize what has been happening. Flare-ups here, flare-ups there, flare-ups in many different sectors of the island. And some of those communities, is communities that the peace management would have teams heavily working in those communities, because you still have to have some unholding process. You still have to be there helping them to understand that there's a next way, of dealing with things. And again, we really are an aggressive set of people. So it is the reality, and we definitely treat with this thing, or have to, in a holistic way, treat with the crime problem like an epidemic. Funny enough, look at this pandemic. Look at the coronavirus. The whole COVID situation. The government is running down, dealing with it. You know, I think we need the same energy and approach to deal with crime and violence, because it is an epidemic. It is like a disease, you know what I mean? So we need just the way we go into communities and we quarantine and we work in particular areas, and we do it slowly. You know, we block off a particular area, we quarantine area for a period of time. This is the sort of approach that is needed to fight the crime, along with putting in opportunities for the youngsters, because I'm thinking, you know, we need a lot more. We need more opportunities. We need more opportunities for our youth. We need people to be talking to our youth. You know, we definitely need that at this time in Jamaica. One of the major concerns that I'm having personally is that with some of the areas that was so calm and stuff like that, what is happening now? The violence break out in those communities. The effort is going to be 10 times what it took to get that community to some semblance of level or sanity 2, 3 years, 4 years ago. The effort is going to be hard. You know, these youths going back underground, because what? When you go inside of a community as an entity, you know, as an individual from an entity as well, because the entity is what it is, you know, but the individuals are very key to the process in these communities. They are key because people have to trust you. Once the trust starts to develop and you start to work, and they're looking forward for you for the mentorship, you know, they're looking to a big brother experience, you know, a fatherly experience. Somebody would talk with them, would move them from point A to point B, help them on a day-to-day basis, step by step, to do the things that is necessary to turn their lives around. When you don't have an entity or individuals now from the entities on the ground, speaking of social workers, violence interrupters, and all these personnel, you don't have them on the ground anymore. These guys go back under, right? So we are having a serious epidemic as it relates to crime right now. Not just coronavirus. We're having a crime epidemic in Jamaica right now. When you look on Westmoreland, what happened in Westmoreland the other day, I mean, it is frightening. Parish like Westmoreland, I mean, over the weekend, 5, 6 persons murdered. That never happened. You know, we would never think of that. And other places, you know, and the type of murders and the places that people get killed and all of that. I mean, it is just something that we really need to come together as a country and try and get it right. I said a few years ago on a radio program that what we need is a national committee on crime and violence, so as to take the politics out of it. Because I do not believe that any political party should campaign on crime and violence. You understand me? Because it is a national cry. So whether you're opposition or you're government, whether you're Christian or you're worldlian, you know, whatever you may be, you know, crime and violence in the country will affect you. It will stifle the country. I mean, it is stifling the country. When you look at the youngsters, you know, that get killed, you know. So
Milton, I mean, I hear the passion, I hear the enthusiasm, but as the moderator, I have to ensure that we stay within the time allowed. But thank you, and I would just say, you know, when I was minister in the 2012 to 2016 period, the Peace Management Initiative was a key partner. We consider them a key partner in the crime prevention activities of the ministry. But you know, as I listen to all 3 presenters, I'm reminded of attending the National Forum on Youth Violence Prevention in the United States. And it was a network of communities, of cities and federal agencies that work together to share information and to build local capacity to prevent and reduce youth violence. It sounds very much like what some of the work that Valeria is doing. But what struck me then was at this forum, the lead presenters were agencies like the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, headquartered in Atlanta. And because of the public health approach that they were taking to violence prevention. Then we connected an organization called Cure Violence, which was headed by an epidemiologist, Dr. Gary Slotkin. And we connected Cure Violence with the PMI because Cure Violence had done the research. They had, what would you say, validated their approach in terms of thorough evaluation by, academic researchers, etc., to show the legitimacy of their impact. And I've heard from so many, well, all the presenters have spoken about the need for evidence-based interventions. It can't be just a sort of touchy-feely kind of approach. You need to put your limited resources in areas that's going to have the highest impact. And I've recognized a certain consistency across the three presentations. But I'm going to break now and go straight to a question that's coming from Facebook. Maxine Brown Roberts, what are the current interventions being used? She's asking, I think certainly in particular, Valeria, to talk about some of the more effective interventions that's being used in these cities. She wants a definition of crime versus violence. I think it's really crime versus violent crime. And I think violent crime would be typically murder, shooting, rape, robbery, assault, as opposed to things like housebreaking or larceny. And the second question she had are, what are some of the reasons given for the young people to turn to crime in this community? So Joanna, I'm going to ask you to speak to some of the specific interventions that's used regionally that have been proven to be most effective. And then I'm going to ask Milton to answer the second question, which is some of the reasons why our young people turn to crime. So Valeria.
So in regards to the first question about what interventions have worked, so it's important to remember that all the work that is being done has to be localized and needs to take into practice the local context. So for example, on the work being done in Palmira, the Peace in Our Cities models, we always work with civil society actors and local leaders, including mayors and different departments within municipalities, which goes to what Milton said before about building trust and what Joanna was talking about not replicating efforts. So the first step is always to work and have the work be informed by what's happening on the ground and having the violence prevention work be human-centered in practice. So that means taking into practice what other cities have been doing. For example, if a specific type of intervention has worked in a particular city, such as in Colombia, such as in Bogotá, Colombia, but it might not necessarily work in another city in Colombia because of the context. However, you take the best practices and you apply it to and contextualize it to what's happening. So that's how the approach is always followed. So I wouldn't be able to give a concrete example, as it's necessarily absolutely important to take into account the local context and to bring voices from different sectors in that same society. For example, we make sure that youth are represented in conversations about violence regarding youth. We make sure that women are represented, and all the communities that are being affected by this problem are being able to showcase and to provide their input in order to form a solution that works for them. So I believe that in Jamaica, it's also important to include those people who are being affected by a particular type of violence in these conversations happening around violence in order to hear their solutions or ways that would work for them.
Thank you. Milton, the lady wants to know what causes our youth to turn to crime. You are a street man. You have first-hand experience of that.
The what is kind of difficult because there's a number of issues, there's a number of different things, you know. However, I can say clearly some of the things, one of the reasons is the old political system, fragments of the old political system, you know, tradition. Some people is like a family tradition, you know. You're born into a family where you're probably your father, your uncle, your brother, you know, so nobody breaks that cycle. That cycle continues. There are next situation now, out of that same system, you know, somebody fall victim and was not properly treated with, because in this situation, you know, this thing of crime, you know, that is why it is very important to treat crime in a way as if it is a pandemic. You treat with everyone, both victim, right, and perpetrators. You have to deal with, because when you treat with one and leave the other, you know, automatically there is boiling over, there is feelings, you know, somebody is carrying a feeling. Somebody grew up remembering that that was a person that hurt my father, and worse, that was the person who hurt my father, that's his son. I need to take revenge on his son, you know. And there's a next thing of economics as well, where you find, you know, somebody, you find yourself in a position getting favors from individuals where you will have to return favors for individuals, whether you like it, yes or no, you know. So that's why I say to people all the time, I don't think Jamaica has so much of a gang problem, you know. What we have is some poor social norms has become culture in our society, you know, some untreated situation that leave to run. So the youths themselves come and just take up some things. Some youths get involved in things that they know nothing about, you know. Somebody just says something to them and them just be apart because I'm a friend. I defend my brethren, you know. I mean, you see a car leave somewhere and, you know, you're on the corner, you're not in, you're unattached youth. You're not into nothing structured. So you have a lot of time on your hands. So you jump in a car. Next thing you know, when the car go out the road, men in the car had intentions to do something. You know, you jump on a bike. The man on the bike had intentions to do something. I mean, you have to follow through. When you come back, I mean, the spoil is so sweet that it gradually dry you, you know. So it's a number of things.
You're really saying the overarching thing is the culture of violence, and the
culture of violence is overarching.
Not so much the individual.
No.
I want to go now to follow up on something Joanna said. Joanna, you said there was no collaboration between the actors, the various actors performing social interventions. I remember when I was minister, there was one community where competing NGOs that were financed under the Citizen Security and Justice Program were both offering courses and classes in to do with employability for the youth in the area, and they kept cannibalizing each other by each would offer something a little more. Like both started with classes, and then one started offering meals with the classes, and everybody moved to them, and then the other one came back with offering a stipend to come to the class, and then everybody, and it became NGOs competing for participation, and I guess ultimately for resources. Could you speak a little more specifically and give us some examples of additional examples of how no collaboration between the actors, you know, created conflicts and inefficiencies?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, when you say that you have several actors with various types of intervention taking place, there is that kind of, when there's no collaboration, there is a competitive nature that is going to take place between the programs. I'll never forget when we launched our the gang report in March last year, just before COVID hit, we were fortunate to have Kellyanne Magnus, the executive director of Fight for Peace, as part of the our panel. And from her experience was that at some points they were viewing it almost as if where the community members were playing T-shirt bingo, which is that they put on the T-shirt of whichever social intervention happened to be taking place at any given time. And she highlighted the harm that it can cause when it is that there's a competing intervention taking place, because one intervention might be undoing the effects of another intervention. And there's definitely a competitive space within the NGOs because, as you said, they're battling for the resources, right? And one of the things that we do need to overcome is that if we are genuinely interested in making the impact that needs to be made in these communities, then there has to be that collaboration. And that's one of the approaches that some NGOs have really started taking. For example, Fight for Peace. Fight for Peace realized that what was really needed was a coordinating mechanism, and they started really acting as a coordinating entity where they started bringing together the various sports, setting them up on particular days so that that kind of competitiveness between the various NGOs wasn't really happening. And it's something as well that local development partners, and I think probably Milton can speak to this, local development partners in the most recent initiative, I think it was PMI, VPA, and another entity, if I'm not mistaken, Milton, there was a third entity, MYF, Multi-Youth Foundation. And one of the stipulations of the award of that contract was that Multicare Youth Foundation. And one of the stipulations was that there had to be collaboration between the three entities. And so that was pushing the kind of collaborative effort, because people are recognizing that there is that lack of collaboration, the harm that it can cause, and we are able to achieve more if it is that there is a coordinated collaborative effort. And so when it is that we have international partners or government agencies that might be awarding contracts or awarding funding for NGOs to take to operate within communities, the entities have to have some kind of systemic way of organizing themselves, organizing the NGOs to make sure, because even when the government agencies are in there, there has to be an awareness of which agencies are doing what, so that the interventions themselves can fill in the gaps that exist. The NGOs that are coming into the communities need to fill in the gaps that another NGO intervention might be leaving. And that's the only way with the collaboration we can actually achieve any difference.
Joanna, are you only speaking about collaboration between NGOs, or what about the government, the various government actors? I remember there's so many different projects in the various different ministries of government. There is some poverty alleviation here, there is some CSJP there. You're
absolutely right. You're absolutely right. So one of the things that I found when I was doing the monitoring evaluation report, there has been a consistent recognition by government agencies about the the systemic lack of coordination that has taken place for decades. And so you have that, it's not just within the NGO sector, it's also within the Ministry of Developments and departments and agencies that are taking place. And that is something that has to be addressed if it is that we're going to be moving forward as a society, making sure that the government agencies are collaborating with each other, making sure that they're coordinating with the NGOs that might be filling in the gaps that the government itself cannot fulfill, and making sure that there is an entity. So even when it is that you don't have a government agency that might be present in a community, the government still needs to act as a coordinator, overseeing whatever is implemented in these communities, because at the end of the day, the ultimate responsibility of these communities is the government. So even when NGOs are in there, or there's another ministry or department or agency in there, there has to be an entity that acts as a single coordinator for whatever interventions are being conducted.
All right, thank you. Good point. I wanted to swing over now to Dr. Shane Alexis. I think he has some concerns. He has some questions for the panelists. points you'd like to highlight. Shane?
Hi, everyone. Evening. Great presentations. The question I had for the panel generally is we're talking about crime nationally, and there are a lot of vulnerable groups, specific groups that have, there are idiosyncrasies or specifics in how we deal with them, whether it's violence against children, women, the LGBTQ community. I'm thinking about mentally ill individuals that commit crimes and the different subgroups, and not just to speak about crime. So I guess going through the panel, Peter, perhaps they can just comment from their experience or perspectives on how we can tackle here in Jamaica, sort of in the Caribbean context, in Jamaica's context. Yes, we have a propensity to be violent, but how do we manage these specific groups of vulnerable groups in the communities, especially in our inner city communities, rural communities? We've seen crime spreading right across all parishes. So as you said earlier, you have to be specific based on the community's context, but we also have some social norms. So that would be the question that I have.
Milton, I see your hand up. You want to lead off as the first panelist to respond to Shane's question?
Okay. Sorry, there's hand up thing. All right, so let me let me say though. It was in regards to Joanna's point that in regards to the collaboration, I want to say a few years ago, under the then Portia Simpson government, because I'm in this thing for a number of years now, we had Jamaica House. We had a time when we all meet at Jamaica House. Every single agencies that work in Jamaica, even the government agencies, Ministry of Labor, Social Security, every one of them that you just named, Senator Bunting. And let me tell you, what we did those days is to say who is at, who is going in next, what need to be done. There's a list of 30 families, just an example, a list of 30 families. This is the need. There are some children in that area that needs to be in school, so and so. So we would follow on, and people would move in a very coordinated way. But what coordinated way? But guess what happened? There's no sustenance where these things are concerned. And what we need in Jamaica is stability. Whether the government change, yes or no, there must be policies that stay in place, good policies that we see can move our country and our communities forward. And those are some practices. Patricia Bars, was the person that led that process at the time at Jamaica House. When we don't have it in Jamaica House, we used to be at another hotel, and stuff like that. So that's good practice. And I am in total agreement that there was some serious tripping that went on in the past few years that I can tell you, people who run agencies, organizations are regretting it right now today, because, the gains of one organization is wiped out by a next organization action. And that was really my concern from then. And I'm hoping that going forward, it will change.
But
like I said,
if you just now transition the Dr. Alexis question.
That's what I was going into.
What are the interventions for the vulnerable groups? The women, the children, he said the mentally ill, the sex workers, the LGBTQ community. What specific interventions or types of interventions do we need?
All right. So, when you talk about these groups, it is always a touchy thing. But let me start with the LG. Most of those individuals, they perpetrate violence upon each other. They perpetrate the violence upon themselves. I can tell you, in Jamaica today, not like 15, 20 years ago, where people used to see them, stone them, or hurt them. It is not like that in Jamaica anymore. You know, the Peace Management Initiative run a number of different interventions with those guys. I think it was Julian Robinson who got some funding to run an intervention. And I can tell you, I spent 4 days and 3 nights in Ocho with about 28 of such individuals. What we were doing is doing some behavior modification work. When we say behavior modification work with them, it's not about their sexual preference or anything like that. It is about the way they conduct themselves. It's about the way they treat with each other. And I can tell you, I have some experience with them, or them hurting each other, and they're very cruel to each other, you know? And the next problem is that there's certain section in the city, Alpha Tree Road and some other places where those guys, they rob women. You understand me? They rob women, they hurt people, run you down to take away your things, you know? So it is not that.
I'm not sure that Shane wanted to focus exclusively on LGBTQ. I think he wanted just to speak about interventions for vulnerable groups in
no, I'm going down the line, you know, because when you look now, women, so I'm telling you about the different types of intervention to the specific groupings. The Peace Management Initiative, along with other agencies, I can't remember offhand right now who is out there working presently, but you have right now the women empowerment groups. You have the Mothers Against Gun Violence, who today had some form of celebration anniversary thing, you know, because what they did is to brought the mothers together who lost children or loved ones, husband or whatever, through violence, you know, and try to work with them. Set them up in some entrepreneurship.
So there are specialist NGOs. There are specialist NGOs that are initiatives, projects that deal with the individual groups, the individual vulnerable groups. I want to throw it over to Valeria now and hear what's happening on a regional basis.
Thank you for that question. I think it's a really important question because when we talk about violence being committed to different marginalized groups and what can be done to address that, it's important to also remember that sometimes the violence being perpetrated to minority groups is also intersectional. So you will see, for example, certain minorities who identify, for example, minority women being affected by specific violence more than others. So in order to find an approach that would work in addressing this type of violence, I think it's always important to put the individual at the center and to create human-centered practices to advocate for these individuals and try to reduce violence. Always thinking about, for example, we're talking about the LGBT community, what would be best practices that would focus on interventions that would address the specific violence they face, but that might not be the same violence that other groups and other minorities face. So I think interventions that put the individual at the center is always important, specifically when dealing with minority and marginalized groups. Thank you.
Joanna, you wanted any input on that?
Absolutely. So there are several things for me, which is that I think legislation is very weak in this country. Vulnerable groups need to have protection from the government, that is the main entity that is supposed to be affording them the protection that they need. For example, one of the things that I really would like to see change, that I think legislation needs to be created for, you know, I mean, for me, you know, Capri did an LGBTQ report on the social costs of excluding them, you know, and Equality Jamaica just came out and said that there are mental health practitioners who would not treat members of this community. Mental health is a huge thing in Jamaica, regardless of whichever vulnerable population you are referring to. And we need to work on our access to mental health. We also did a report recently on mental health for children, right? And so what we're finding is that there are a lot of issues, especially when for people who live in vulnerable communities and they're experiencing violence. There's trauma there that is going untreated, right? And that trauma needs to be treated. Legislation-wise, a policy that I would personally like to see, especially as it relates to youth, is this thing where schools are allowed to expel or suspend kids. Given the population of youths that participate in crime, one of the things that I would love to see, and I actually worked for 1 year with the Children's Defense Fund in New York, specifically on how schools' disciplinary actions push kids out of schools. We shouldn't push kids out of schools if it is that they're violating rules and regulations. We should instead put them in situations that help them to understand or build relationships in their community. So instead of suspending somebody, allocate them to a month of community work, right? So making sure that there's legislation in place where kids can stay in schools, so that we don't continually pushing them out. Making sure that there's legislation and regulations in place so that kids, no matter what background, can get the help that they need. Making sure that the LGBT community has access to the mental health facilities that they need, because they are struggling with the very same situations that any other group is struggling with. And so we really need to put mechanisms in place to ensure that the mental health and access to the same social services, the same policing, if it is that there are challenges taking place between two members who are in a same-sex relationship, they should be able to go to the police and without fear of repercussions, without fear of being stigmatized, without being feared of being jailed, right? And there are making steps towards making sure that domestic violence is dealt with by the JCF. The JCF has just opened up several domestic violence centers, right? But we need to make sure that the facilities, the institutions are in place, that we don't continue to marginalize these individuals.
Thank you. And just to support what you were saying earlier about the students, when I was minister, I came across, I think it was Dr. Elizabeth Ward and the Violence Prevention Alliance had done a study that if students who left high school, who dropped out or were expelled for whatever reason, discontinued school after grade 9, were 8 or 9 times as likely to be recruited by a criminal gang as those who did the full course of study till they were 18 or 19. And I was able to speak with my colleague, Minister of Education, and essentially got the principals to stop expelling students, because what they did was they got rid of their problem in their high school, but then created a bigger problem for the community and the society, because these unattached youth, Milton, as you would know, then with a lot of time on their hands and hanging out in communities, they became fertile recruiting ground for criminal gangs. I have a question that I guess, begs asking, based on listening to all the presentations, is a question from Omi. Says, why is it that crime prevention is not a priority? Crime prevention is not a priority. And just to support what Omi is saying with a little information from the budget of the Ministry of National Security. When I left there in 2015-16, the capital budget for, let's say, operations, which was the police and the military, was about $2 billion. The capital budget for half of that $2 billion was for the CSJP, Citizen Security and Justice Program. So that was the social interventions, the supporting the work of the PMI, other NGOs, etc. By 2019, 2020, that $2 million had increased to $20 billion. But the 1 billion that was there for social interventions was discontinued. So that went from 1 to 0, and the other went from 1 to 20. So crime prevention went to 0, and crime control increased 20 times. So, you know, just to put some numbers behind what I consider the misprioritization of spending, there's no balance between crime control and crime prevention. It tends to be totally consumed by crime control. And I'm going to throw that one to Valeria. I see her hand up.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to make a quick comment on what Joanna said about making policies and programs that support marginalized groups. An example from one of our member cities in Guadalajara, I just want to give this quick example. They actually created a specialized division as part of the municipal police to specifically attend violence against women. And before, surprisingly, violence against women and domestic violence itself was not a reportable crime. It was filed under disturbance to public order. So just making this specific difference, changing violence against women from public disorder to a reportable crime that specifically affects women is something that led to more people reporting and more people being able to actually get help through this division. So I believe that what you mentioned was extremely important, and supporting programs that specifically target in a good way the support that these marginalized groups need. Now, to quickly answer the question about violence not being a priority.
Crime prevention not being a priority. I believe that as I mentioned in the presentation, sometimes there's this lack of awareness about how crime prevention and solving crime and helping to work and prevent crime is connected to the social well-being of a community as a whole. We tend to focus, and cities tend to focus on other more popular interventions, such as social and economic interventions, and forget about crime, without fully understanding the connection between these two and how peaceful societies and eventually promote more just and more accurate and where societies who are able to thrive more as crime prevention is addressed. They tend to focus on the other aspects that are more politically correct and popular than crime, because it's usually a topic that most political leaders do not want to address. So at Peace in Our Cities, for example, we make sure that when we talk about cities joining, there's that political will to implement the solutions and the evidence base that exists to address violence. Thank you. Milton, you can give your perspective. Why is crime prevention neglected? Why is it not number one on the agenda of a government?
Well, I don't know if I can answer that question because, you know, what I can say is that crime prevention is very, very important, you know. I think in some cases we tend to be a more reactive society than a proactive society. When you have made mention of something, Senator Bunting, that is very touchy, but it is a fact. When you talk about the self-esteem of our youngsters, now a lot of people, when we talk about youth, I just want to make this clear that I'm not talking about males. When I say youth, it's a representation of both male and females. When our youth get kicked from school, that in itself is a self-esteem issue, right? And you create a market right now and for criminals, because those guys are going to find themselves somewhere where they are welcome, where they are wanted, and where they will feel empowered. Instead, when I used to go to Winard Road all-age school, from the age of 13-year-old, I could make grater, wooden spoon, and all these things. Fast forward now, they need to put more of those technical things in these schools so these youngsters can learn to use their hands and to make things so as to help them feel a sense of purpose so as to have them not behaving in a manner like they are, because they're feeling like rejects. So for me, crime prevention is those things. Crime prevention starts from in the schools. Crime prevention starts from our policies. So we need to really step up on those things as a people and to see how best we can move the country forward.
Thank you, Joanna. You are the policy research expert. Can you tell us why is it that our governments, and let me say specifically, this government who has been in office for the last 6 years, why is it that they are so attached to the suppression of crime, to the suspension of people's human rights, to the militarized approach to policing, as opposed to the crime prevention and the social interventions and the sort of approach that has been advocated by the panelists today?
So I just want to make my perspective very clear, which is that I equally support crime control and crime prevention. The situation that we find ourselves in Jamaica now, we can pour all the money into crime prevention, but the way our JC has been severely underfunded for many years, for decades. And the reality is that there had to be some increased funding. For me personally, I think that the JCF needed the funding it needed. The technological advances, the infrastructure, the men and women who serve in the JCF, some of the conditions of the police stations were just really, really bad, right? And so there had
but I must intervene. It's not the JCF that's getting the allocation, it's the JDF, it's the military that's getting it, not the police.
So I understand that JDF's budget has also increased, but JCF's budget has also increased. And even with security strengthening project that is funded by IDB, we see where technological upgrades of JCF is taking place. Now, I firmly believe that social intervention needs the same injection of investment and capital that is needed to break the cycle of violence that is taking place in our society. But where the JCF was at the time, I firmly believe that it also needed that injection of capital, because you are not going to be able to address the crime situation in Jamaica if it is that the crime control mechanism is not there to address the situation while it is that you build up the capacity of the crime prevention. So I do believe that equal investment is needed for both control and crime prevention perspective, based on Jamaica's situation, where we have the highest per capita murder rate in the Caribbean, Latin America and Caribbean. Now, one of the things for me is that while it is that there are social interventions that need to be taking place, the study that we did, testing clearly shows that while it is that we have to put money into crime prevention and social interventions, we need to know which crime prevention strategies and which social intervention strategies need to have the injection of cash or the injection of investment. And if it is we're not having monitoring and evaluation, where we know where to put the money, we know where to put the human capital, or know where to put the technological capital, then it's going to be a situation where we're just going to be doing the same over and over, which is the very definition of insanity, right? And so Jamaica is such that we have to have that equal investment of crime control and crime prevention.
All right, I'm coming into the final round of comments now. I'm going to invite concluding remarks from all the panelists, and then I'm going to consider Shane, I'm going to consider you a panelist in this regard, but I'm going to ask you to come at the very end and not just make your concluding comments, but also I'm going to invite you to wrap and thank the panelists. But I'm going to start in the same order that we kicked off with. So I'm going to ask Valeria, since Joanna just spoke, then I'll go to Milton, and come back to Joanna for her concluding comments, and then directly to you, Shane, for a vote of thanks and summary of the panel discussion. Valeria.
Thank you so much for letting me be part of this panel. I want to say that it's extremely important to see and to witness political leaders engage in important discussions on crime prevention and violence prevention with different actors. We have Joanna, who is a researcher and can provide that perspective and unique database evidence to this conversation. And I want to congratulate everyone here for promoting these efforts and to encourage all of us to continue having these important conversations about crime and violence, always engaging with different actors who can provide different perspectives to make sure that we can move forward with policies and practices that are evidence informed and focused on people to make sure that we're able to reduce violence and also to reduce crime and urban violence. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Milton,
Yes,
wrap-up comment?
Yeah, man, I want to say thanks, for inviting me to be a part of this panel. It's very informative, and I'm always passionate and willing to participate in any forum as it relates to youth crime and violence. For me, I want to say I am totally in agreement with crime control and with crime prevention and control, because while you're doing the control, you need to do some preventative work. But if you're doing the control work without the preventative work, you will always be on the defense. You will always be after controlling. So you'll have no hand in sight, and the thing will only get worse, but both of them need to work, in hand in hand. And again, for me, I would like to see a national committee on crime and violence, with the minister of the day being a part of that, the government of the day rather being a part of that, and more so the private sector and a few simple common residents, local people, grassroots people being a part of that, so you can hear their voices and understand what is happening, and how to shape the necessary interventions to have the preventions as well. So for me, it's a good thing. I'm just looking forward to see the crime prevention put back on the front burner. The police and the military alone can't do it, and they need that support, because the police and the military are only going to catch these individuals at the end. They are like the bags for the bread. You know what I mean? You need to catch it to catch a bread, from the early bakings, so as to put the spices and the flavors. You don't need to wait until it reaches bagging stage. And that's just my concern right now.
All right, thank you. And you spoke to a national committee, and there was a question earlier whether the crime management and oversight committee was working, because that, in a sense, has been an attempt. I'm a member of that committee as an opposition representative, and I would just say it's still in its early days. There is potential, but at this point, I think we are still locked in the old paradigms of government versus opposition, and that we're not open to collaborating and taking genuine recommendations. There tends to be too much of just as how you have a culture of violence in communities, I think there's too much of an adversarial culture in the politics to immediately get cooperation. But we're working at it. It's a start. And over to you now, Joanna.
Thank you, Senator Bunting, and thank you to your team for putting together this event. And it was a much needed discussion in terms of where we're going and what needs to be done. There is still a lot more discussion that needs to take place. The Crime Monitoring and Oversight Committee that is being headed by PSOJ is still in its early stages. I myself am very hopeful for what it will achieve, just because it's trying to take that, remove that partisan stance that, you know, that we really had throughout our history. And definitely in terms of collaborating between government, opposition, and various ministries, agencies, and NGOs. And I definitely think that moving forward, we need to recognize, be willing to learn from our mistakes as a society. You know, when it is that we talk about monitoring and evaluation, that last part of the process about learning is often forgotten, and we need to learn from our mistakes. We need to learn from each other. We need to be able to adapt when it is that we need to adapt to move forward together as a country. And moving forward, I really think that that kind of balance that needs to take place between crime prevention and crime control needs to be a collaborative effort between everybody.
Balance, cooperation, and learning. I think that's a nice trio there. And for the last word, the chairman of the National Security Task Force, Dr. Alexis.
Yes, thank you, Senator. Great job with hosting tonight's event. I want to thank all the panelists for participating, Joanna from Capri, Milton from Peace Management, and Valeria, giving us an international perspective has been really very useful and very eye-opening. And of course, our Facebook audience on all the different platforms of the People's National Party. In summarizing tonight, I think it's, you know, community stands out, the need for a commonality in what we're trying to achieve, what we're trying to do. And of course, a community-based approach, meaning I think sometimes we are a little bit too top-heavy in our approach, as Milton pointed out, and Valeria, that we need to come from the bottom up. We need consensus on communication. There has to be a fixity of purpose, at least a specific goal that's coordinated and that we're communicating between agencies of the state, NGOs, the community itself, the victims, all stakeholders, and of course, compassion. All of us are here tonight because we care about Jamaica and Jamaicans, and we have to remember that it's, you know, law enforcement has a very difficult job. The legislators have a difficult job. The victims have a very painful experience, and those of us who support them and live and work with them, you know, we all have to have a compassionate approach. And of course, finally, it takes cash to care. We have to invest and put our money where our mouths are. We can't keep just simply picking policies out of the air or trying to implement initiatives without the necessary and requisite infrastructure and investment in the community. So I think we've had a great discussion. I want to just once again thank the behind the scenes organizers at the Office of the Leader. Want to thank everyone who made this possible to have a mature, responsible conversation. We want to demonstrate that the People's National Party is a responsible opposition, that we are capable of including wide stakeholder participation and views as we support the Shadow Minister, Senator Bunting, in what he has to do in terms of representing plausible and credible alternatives and solutions to crime in Jamaica. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great evening.